When you are courageous enough to face it, you move through it. Afterwards, there is so much freedom. The sensation of this weight lifted off of your chest, lifted off of your shoulders, lifted off of you entirely from moving through it and expressing it. So I want to just speak that it's very normal to feel afraid to approach this at all. And it's so worth it to be courageous enough to do so. So today we are going to talk about emotional overload versus emotional processing, what that looks like during grief, throughout grief, and how to navigate that world. Do you want to start us off?
I was thinking, when we were first talking about this subject, we were also looking at how, especially early on, in our grieving process, there can be a lot of survival reactivity, and we were thinking about how talking about how there's that level of real heightened emotion sometimes, or for some people it's almost no emotion, depending on their survival mode. But then after that, there's still these experiences we have where there's this range of where we're doing regular or quite useful, healthy, well within the range of normalcy kind of emotional processing, letting out feelings, letting feelings come up, being with the feelings, going looking for feelings, etc., etc. But then I think there's the way we were talking about it. There's these other times where we dip into a place of so much emotional volume that we're kind of at risk, and the further we go in that direction, the more we do actually become at risk of some kind of not just emotional overload, as we're calling it, but some kind of harm.
Yeah, so with harm, that can look like self-harm. Often when, not often, but sometimes when people get so emotionally overwhelmed, they self-harm as a coping mechanism. So that's one example. And self-harm can take many forms. It can be breaking like a barrier of your skin. It can also be a form of an eating disorder. So if
Mm-hmm.
you are having disordered eating, that's harming yourself. And then it
Mm-hmm.
can also lead into harm of others. And that can also take many forms, such as neglecting children, not making sure your
Mm-hmm.
children are eating, or being verbally abusive without realizing it. So there's
Mm-hmm.
lots of different expressions of harm,
Yeah.
more so than just what people would think of, which I think is homicide. And so
Sure.
homicide would be the ultimate extreme that we
Right.
absolutely hope no one is getting to. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
very nuanced spectrum. So, really taking a look at the impact of yourself on others. And it's not just yourself grieving and the impact that has on others, but if you are displaying any behaviors of emotional or physical abuse or neglect to yourself or to anyone else. And this usually happens within the immediate family that you live with. And it can happen
Mm-hmm.
outside of that sphere too, with coworkers
Mm-hmm.
or road rage or people at the grocery store or anything in that regard.
I really appreciate you bringing in some of the different examples and talking about the spectrum. Yeah, certainly homicides at one end. I also think of suicide as being close to that end.
Yes, exactly.
And
Thank you.
that's where some folks go when the emotional overload happens for them in a grieving process.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, like quitting things, running away from things, moving, the kinds of like big changes that some folks find themselves, inviting or starting because they just can't deal anymore because of this grieving process, and that's totally understandable. I can really relate. There's a number of different grieving books out there and grieving resources out there that say don't make any big decisions in your first year, in part because of this. Our emotions are in our both our emotional processing and the emotions that are coming up in a normal range. Normal is probably not the best word, but in a healthy range, that's enough. But if we then are dipping into emotional overload, then we are much more likely to quit jobs, quit relationships, quit friendships, even quit families, quit life, quit taking care of ourselves, all those kinds of things. So, like you're saying, I think looking out for where not just a moment of expression, but the way that we're navigating the grieving dips over toward harm of ourselves or others
Mm-hmm.
is an important indicator to be on the lookout for.
I think what you just said also points to nervous system dysregulation. So if someone is entering into a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, the fight would be potentially ending a really important relationship that you wouldn't have normally ended, given if you were regulated. The flight might be moving, which is the example you brought up, to a different location or city when you actually were doing pretty well in your city. You're just trying to psychologically run away from the problem. The freeze would be feeling nothing whatsoever and just being totally numb. And the fawn would be something towards someone else in your life,
Yeah,
such
like
as
getting,
extreme placation or
yeah,
codependency.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I love that you brought that up. And that I think is an important framework to put around this, because when we get to a place of emotional overload, our nervous system really does step in to try and take care of us, try and get us away from what it perceives as a threat to our life, or a danger to us. And in this
Mm-hmm.
case, it's the feelings. But survival mode only has the four options. So when we click over into survival because our nervous system reads this emotional expression as too much, then yeah, we are going to fight it out or run from it or freeze up or start trying to please other people so we have a sense of being safer in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those are, I think, also we're less likely to catch ourselves in the moment if we go that far, if we're into fight or flight or freeze or appease, because those states aren't as they're not built for self-awareness.
It's
But
true.
yeah, but where we can notice that is typically in the aftermath. When we calm down a little bit, we can be like, oh, like those thoughts I was having or that action I was doing was definitely like running away from this situation or running away from people that are important to me. Assessing that in the aftermath, and then looking for ways we can support ourselves not to have that happen again.
Yeah, and I think ways to prevent it from happening again is first acknowledging that it happened and then seeing a pattern of it happening and then trying to build an incredible amount of self-awareness to identify it when it's happening. And
Mm-hmm.
if you can do that, it's so powerful. That's almost the most difficult piece here, but also the
Mm-hmm.
most powerful piece there is to identify when you are in it.
Yeah.
But it takes
Yeah.
a lot of time and
Yeah.
practice. You definitely don't do it your first try. So
Right.
I don't want anyone listening to feel hard on themselves because they didn't do it their first 100 times.
Yeah. I think that's such an important thing to bring up too. Like I was saying, we're most likely to notice what we did in survival mode after the fact. But the more we're paying attention, the more we're tuned into it, the more we're looking for those signs, we can get closer and closer and closer to the moment and then actually catch ourselves and keep ourselves from going that route,
Mm-hmm.
falling into survival, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I think I love that the way you're putting that too, because that's the probably the most difficult moment to try and catch it. And a lot of people won't for, like you say, maybe 100 times, but if you keep making that effort, you will eventually be able to catch yourself there. And there's lots of things to do in advance of that so that that doesn't have to become the sort of like your last chance to do something different about it. I'd like to actually bounce from there to the opposite end of the spectrum for a second to just talk about our programming and how
Mm-hmm.
that influences us and
Mm-hmm.
how knowing about that can help us navigate this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll start off and then I'll turn it over to you.
Go ahead.
Um, the part I'm thinking about is how, for every one of us, there's the level of emotional support we got when we're growing up and how that programs our emotional system to be able to navigate emotion. Most of us don't get that these days, unfortunately. And so our survival system learns to do some of the discharging of our emotions for us, or emotional energy for us. Like we've already been saying, it only has the four methods: fight, flight, freeze, and appease. And those are pretty messy. They tend to make more problems for us than doing emotional processing. So it's really normal for many of us to go into a survival mode around feelings, period, or to
Mm-hmm.
have high survival reactivity around any level of feelings, whether there are feelings or someone else's feelings. So that programming is already kind of working against us a little bit, right? It's we're more likely, as I say, to go into survival mode, even just around like a light anxiety or light worry, let alone something huge like grief or sorrow or despair. I know that there was a part that you wanted to bring in here about gender differences. Do you want to mention that, or gender programming differences?
Yeah, so we're all socialized to, or almost all of us are socialized to exist in the binary of one gender. And then as we grow up, some of us decide to not subscribe to that anymore. So people who are socialized, raised as boys turning into men, are taught don't cry, man up, stuff your feelings. And I recently heard this comedian say this line: I'm so jealous of women. They get to cry and have friends.
Yeah.
And that really struck me because I never realized the depth of the pain there of being socialized as a boy in our society, that having emotions literally negates socializing. And what a tragedy that is for half of our population growing into adulthood, using the other mechanisms of expressing emotions, such as anger or fighting or abuse, which turns into a whole bunch of issues
Mm-hmm.
like domestic violence and homicide and all these things. And it's not that
And suicide.
women don't do those things either, but proportionally, it's so much more um, men doing it. I just want to have an extra layer of permission to feel given to anyone out there who was raised with this feeling of not being allowed to have emotions at all. That this is going to be a much more baby step thing to just even access an emotion. And if an
Mm-hmm.
anger comes up or a freeze or a fawn response comes up, to be able to identify that and introspectively ask, what's the emotion there?
Mm-hmm.
Instead
Mm-hmm.
of just playing into it. Because if there's any emotion and then there's the survival reactivity, alone is going to take unlearning in order to get into emotional processing whatsoever.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm glad you bring that up too. The unlearning part is so important. And we can, like, fortunately, we have these amazing plastic brains. We can reprogram the way that we relate to even feelings. And it takes time. I think the
Mm-hmm.
example you gave already of, not catching yourself in survival mode 100 times is realistic. If we
Mm-hmm.
want to reprogram and change how we relate to feelings and give ourselves more room to be able to relate to feelings without going into survival mode, that does take time. That does take effort to and reiteration to help the nervous system and the brain learn. Oh, there's this other avenue, this other route we can go when these feelings come up. So important to do that work even alongside this grieving process if you're in one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love too the way that you really focus on what you like, the piece that you could do at this moment. If there's something happening to you, if you're having an experience. Well, an emotional experience is what I'm going for here. If you're having an emotional experience, naming it, right? Oh, like something, I'm feeling something, something's happening to me, is a great place to start. Just to notice, like, oh, I'm having a thing. And then if you can get some feelings words named in there too, that helps your nervous system and your brain know what's happening to you. Know that it's not a tiger yanking on your leg.
Mhm.
And then when we help with that kind of identification, the nervous system actually supports us to downregulate. Once it figures out, oh, this isn't a predator moment or a danger moment, I'm going to live through this. It's just a feeling. Oh, okay. Well, I'll turn down the heart rate a little bit. I'll let you breathe a little more. I'll get your digestion going again, all that stuff. So it's really such an important technique, even if you've never done it before and you're like not even sure how to do it. Along those lines, though, and also part of this supporting ourselves to have more opportunities for emotional processing than emotional overload would be getting pretty good at naming feelings, identifying feelings, having words in your brain for feelings. Most of us, especially if you're raised as a boy, we get like four feelings words, mad, glad, sad, and I was going to say horny, but I don't know if that's a feeling word. Um, but that's it, like, and so expanding our repertoire so that we know, oh, this is grief, or this is sorrow, or this is despair. And I don't even know if people listening will notice the delineation between those feelings, but knowing that, when I'm having an experience, I can name it with some granularity. That also helps our nervous system know even sooner, oh, okay, this is a feeling. This is something I can deal with.
I think those feelings you mentioned that are the only ones boys are given access to are actually umbrella feelings. And
Yeah,
within sadness,
yeah,
there's so many nuances of sadness.
yeah.
The ability to get clear on exactly which one it is and finding that in your body and linking them. Oh, this sensation here in my chest. Oh, that is the sensation of despair. That is going to be the processing that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's such an important piece to bring into this sort of like emotional mapping that we can do for
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. Tuning into when we're having an emotional experience, noticing first, I'm having one, here it is. Maybe even naming it, I'm feeling something, before we even know what to tell us or, how to delineate what the feeling is. Then as we can get closer to it, okay, this is actually, this feels like sadness to me. Is it a kind of sadness? Like, is it just raw sadness, or is it, oh, it's deeper. It's got, oh, it's like sorrow. And then, like you're saying, tuning into what's the physical and or energetic experience in our body of that feeling, and beginning to, like you're saying, catalog. Okay, so my sorrow feels like this. It's got this really heavy heart. I'm barely breathing. It's got like this sort of like slow, sluggish energy in my belly. Just really getting to know the feeling and being able to identify it in these physical ways, like you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
is the processing. But it's also training our nervous system to know that when this happens to me, it could be this feeling, not a tiger yanking on my leg. I want to go back to, I said, if you're trained raised as a boy, you get told about four feelings. You don't get to have them all. You really only get to have mad or glad, and horny if your partner's into that. Um,
Yeah.
but you don't get to have sad.
Mm-hmm.
That's not one that you actually get to use. You might be able
No.
to know about it, so you can recognize it in your, person who's raised as a woman bodied person, friend, who, lover, or whoever you're with. Oh, are you sad?
Oh, you're allowed to have that. Let me hold space for you having that.
Yeah, you get to have that one.
Yeah. I also want to add on to what you said about naming, specifying, and getting clear about it in the body. That for some people who are more kinesthetic, it might actually start from the body. It
Yeah.
might start as an observation of
Yes.
physical sensation,
Yeah.
an observation of energetic movement somewhere
Yeah.
in the stomach, and then putting the piece together that that's what that is this emotion. So it can go both ways. It can start with identifying the emotion and then finding it in the body, or it can be finding it in the body and then identifying it, the emotion.
Definitely. One of the places we can notice first is just in our body. Like something's feeling something. What is it? And tuning in. And for many of us, that is the first place we notice, especially the more tuned in we get to how our feelings show up in our bodies. For others of us, and I think this is what we get trained for, in our upbringing, is to relate to feelings or a feelings experience via a story. And so the first thing that we often notice is the story that we're telling ourselves, or the complaints that are rolling around in our heads, or the framework I'm putting on this particular experience I'm having. And it can be difficult to notice because we're doing that all the time, right? We're just sort of like, oh, many of us are endlessly chattering in there about what's happening to us, and that's very normal. So it can be a challenge to slow it down enough to really notice it. But I think that is such an important part, whether the experience is showing up in our body or in our heads with the story that we have going. Tuning into and noticing what's happening to us is such an important part of being able to do emotional processing versus finding ourselves in emotional overload.
This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com. So, if someone were to be going into emotional overload, or they're already well into it and having thoughts of harm, what would your advice to them be?
I have a lot to say about that. But I think that part of what we're describing, is that when we find ourselves in emotional overload, and often that's because we've gone into some kind of survival mode instead of just hanging out with even really big or uncomfortable feelings. Recognizing our programming is important to how our feelings show up and how attuned to them we are. Working with our programming so that we can be more attuned to them, whether it's in our body or in our stories, making sure that we're naming our feelings when they come up, making sure that we're learning about our feelings and learning like how they do show up in our bodies if that's not the place where we notice them first, because that's grounding and reassuring to the nervous system itself in an emotional process. As we're doing that, we're retraining the nervous system to know that this experience I'm having is not going to kill me. It is just a feeling. I've been through a bunch of feelings now as I'm learning to catalog these and sitting with them and learning about them. And so I can be with a feeling without automatically going into.
I want to pause you. You just named a super advanced multi step system. Can you give us some bullet points for that?
Yeah, and to
Yeah.
sort of build up our ability to
Yeah.
be with feelings.
Yes.
So that's recognizing where our programming is around feelings. Did we
Uh
get
huh.
emotional support or not? Most of us didn't.
Yeah.
So knowing, like, am I someone who was trained, learning about ourselves, am I someone who was trained to be able to be with feelings? The answer for most of us is not well.
Mm-hmm.
But recognizing that that's working kind of against us is an important part of being able to stay with emotional processing versus going into overwhelm. The main thing to do with that, though, is to begin to work with ourselves so that we can reprogram how we were programmed. So recognize our programming, begin to work with reprogramming how our nervous system relates to feelings. The process that we've been talking about, though we haven't named it as such, is what at the Center for Emotional Education we call notice, name, touch, where you
Mm-hmm.
notice you're having an emotional experience, you name that experience for yourself, and then you be in touch with it for a while. There's physical touch you can give yourself and emotional touch you can give yourself if you want to regulate out of it more quickly. And that's really just putting your own, like your palm to your heart and gently rubbing there, giving yourself light physical touch. You can rub your palms together. You can rub the nape of your neck. You can rub, I really like rubbing the top of my head these days, especially when I'm crying really hard for some reason. All those places are grounding and supportive to the nervous system to know that we're safe to be with this thing. Emotional touch is just empathizing with ourselves. Oh, I see that you're having some feelings coming up. I recognize that you're having an emotional experience. I'm with you in it. I see you. I hear you. I get it. You know, those kinds of expressions to ourselves and even out loud if we're in a room where we feel safe enough to do that, or where we can. Then the third part of touch is this internal thing that you've described of sitting with the feeling that you've named and exploring inside you. What is it like? How do I feel this sorrow? Even you can even do it with pleasure. You can do it with joy. You can do it with all the feelings to help, continue your training, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So that's recognize you have programming, work with your to reprogram your nervous system and how it relates to feelings through notice, name, touch. If you're doing that and you're having feelings come up and you're doing the process that we've described thus far, that's going to help you probably at least half or more times, 5 or more times out of 10, to avoid going into overload, because
Mm-hmm.
you're tending to what the nervous system needs in that moment. If you find yourself maxing out, you start to have thoughts of, you're ruminating. That's one sign of going into overload. You only have like two or three thoughts and they're just coming back through, back through, back through, back through.
Mm-hmm.
Often in fight, it's two options and both of them are abhorrent. I want to fight both of them. In flight, there are only two options and one of them is to leave. In freeze, there are usually no options.
Mm-hmm.
There's just nothing I can do about this. In appease, there are options for other people. I could help so and so. I could help them. Maybe if I help them, they'll, something me. I don't know. For the appeaser, we often don't even get to ourselves. It's just, what can I do for the other people? So if we get into that kind of thinking, just only two options kind of thinking, that's one indicator. When we get more extreme in our actions, survival mode and emotional overload is all about extremities. So we're moving fast or we're hardly moving at all. We're talking really loud or we're talking really quietly. We're eating way too much or we're not eating anything. We're sleeping all the time or we're hardly able to sleep. These kinds
Mm-hmm.
of extreme ends of behavior are also a kind of indicator for us.
Mm-hmm.
When that's happening, the best thing for us to do is to try to get safe. I think that's the perfect umbrella to put it under. Get safe. And that's like, if it means you need to do something to help other people around you be safer, like, get safe. If it's you that's in danger, get yourself safe. If there isn't something else to do in terms of adjusting your shelter or making sure that you are getting enough food or drinking water or enough breath or enough ability to move, then using specific nervous system regulating techniques are the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those things, making sure, like, I would never do this to someone who I found in survival mode. Here, you should eat something, or here, have a drink of water, or like, sit down and do some breathing, because they're not in the state to receive that kind of support or information. But when we can catch ourselves, just slowly moving over to and getting a glass of water and taking a slow sip of it, or a few slow sips, is a kind of regulation to the nervous system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, meeting these physical body needs, moving slowly, allowing some time, all go under this umbrella of getting safe. But then, as I say, there are also regulation techniques that we can use. I frequently use a regulating breath, and I use it so much now that I actually find myself starting to do a regulating breath before I notice that I've gotten so activated that I need to do a regulating breath.
That's awesome.
And I think that's really what we're hoping for. And it's such a clear indicator that your nervous system knows
Mm-hmm.
what's happening to you. And you've made a habit of this skill to downregulate some.
Mm-hmm.
A regulating breath is just making sure that your inhales take about half as long as your exhales and that you're still getting a full breath. You're just spending a longer time exhaling with each breath.
Mm-hmm.
I also like to use touch. If you're doing notice name touch and you're using the physical touch to help you regulate, that's one version or layer. But you can also use touch separate from the notice name touch process as just another way to help bring in more regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I like to go palm to, like, heart chakra. And I'm going to sit up here so you can see me. I rub really slow little circles in that area. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I like to imagine it's the back of a little baby. And I think of that because you want it to be that slow and that nurturing and that tender, right? And there's nerve endings in your palms and in your chest that go up into your neck and into your face that are part of your social engagement system, also as part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So with this breath, you're activating parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. But also with this touch, you're bringing in more rest and digest activation in your nervous system. If you keep that touch going for 30 seconds, though, then you're also releasing oxytocin in your brain, which is the antidote to cortisol, which is often up for many of us when we have stress and as
Mm-hmm.
we go into survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? What kind of regulating strategies do you like to use? I know there's some overlap, but what else do you do?
Yeah. So to add on to the touch one, I'm a big fan of deep pressure therapy. And so I saw a meme that called it squash my soul back into my body. And it's you can do this with a human or a pet or a weighted blanket, but I think that a human or a pet is far superior to a weighted blanket, which is I will have my partner just lay on top of me. And he
Yeah,
weighs twice as much as I do.
so
And
good.
to just have the like deep pressure on my body in that way is incredibly grounding to the nervous system as well. I've also trained my dog to do this. My dog is 60 pounds, and I've taught her to put most of her body weight wherever on my body I want it. I can get it on my stomach or my chest or my legs, wherever it feels necessary. And if you live alone and don't like animals or can't have animals for whatever reason, you can do this with weighted blankets. But usually it takes two weighted blankets. One weighted blanket isn't quite heavy enough to do it.
That's such brilliance. I love that. Yes. Yeah. What a great technique. I just want to underscore some of what's happening there too. That pressure, that touch, especially from a loved one, and it definitely works with pets too, is
Mm-hmm.
by itself, like you're saying, grounding and regulating to the nervous system, but also a source of initiating oxytocin.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so even if some of us really love the pressure, I'm someone who's like, give me all the pressure you got. Like, I love it. I want to be squished. Other people
Mm-hmm.
are like, I don't want to be so squished. For them, a static hug can be the same kind of support. It's not
Mm-hmm.
the same kind of pressure, but it's a safe person holding us. Then call it a static hug because you don't want to be moving your hands. You don't want to be getting all romantic. You don't want to be, in any of the zones that might bring up activation for someone, but just basically a frame for them to hang on as they emote is also a source of regulation and oxytocin release.
Yeah, and that also goes into co-regulation.
Yeah.
So you can co-regulate off of someone who feels safe. Our bodies instinctually look around to the people surrounding us to determine, oh, do they believe we're safe? Oh, okay, then it must be true. Or, oh, they don't
Mm-hmm.
believe it's safe? Oh, it must not be true. And so going into a state of overwhelm, it can be super valuable to co regulate off of someone who is calm, such as an animal or a person near you. I think
Yeah.
that cats can also be really wonderful for this. If you can get your cat to just lay on your chest and purr, you're going to be
Yeah.
getting vibration through your chest from the purring. You're going to be getting the weight of the cat. The cat is calm.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, I think most cats are chill, super, super, super chill. So you can co-regulate off of the cat's energy as well.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that one. My brother died. That's been the grieving process that I've been going through. I went and saved his cat that was abandoned in his house after he passed, and I now have her. Her name is Birdie, and she finds me
Oh,
almost every time I'm crying and will come and just sit with me. It's just so beautiful. It's
that's
really
precious.
such a wonderful thing.
Wow.
If we're in the house with someone who's going through a grieving process and they are going into emotional overload or overwhelm, that we can support them by just regulating our own bodies, right? So many times we want to go in there, we want to be like, oh, what's I can have, what do you need, let's fix it, it's not that, or we just try and talk to them about, it's not that big of a deal, they're in a better place, I'm sure they're okay now, like all this kind of essentially.
Fixing.
Yeah, we're trying to help, but we're trying to fix it so that they don't have these uncomfortable feelings or they are not going into overwhelm.
Mm-hmm.
A much more useful strategy for that person is to regulate ourselves so that their nervous system will see our nervous system is signaling safety. We're signaling,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is like whatever's happening, we're not in danger. And our nervous system, that's too hard to do ours versus theirs. The grieving person who's going into overload's nervous system will see us as more regulated and will gravitate toward our regulation. They will co-regulate toward, and I don't just mean coming toward us, I mean like toward the state that we're in. They may actually approach us. They may want to sit close to us. They may want to get hugs because their nervous system has this sense that that we're safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So same techniques of breathing and some self-touch, even as we're just sitting nearby or even before we've gone in to see if we can be of support to the person who's in overload.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on one more, which is a tricky one to address because it can be um, done too much, which is distraction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, distraction can also be a useful mechanism to push pause on
Yeah,
the escalation of overwhelm.
yeah.
However, distraction can also be a freeze response
Or flight.
or a flight response. So
Yeah,
we don't want the distraction to turn into hours or days or years of distraction.
well put.
But when used properly for 10 to 30 minutes, it can be a moment to pause and then to put the distraction down and to then go do any of these other things that will actually regulate. The distraction will not regulate, but it will pause the escalation when used
Yeah,
properly.
yeah,
Distraction should never be substances or alcohol because that's going to change your mental state. Distraction should be things such as, I hate to say it, but social media is a great distraction.
can be. Yes.
It can be a great distraction,
Yeah,
or watching one show of your
yeah,
favorite show.
yeah.
Or I have certain movies, I call them my comfort food movies, which are
Mm-hmm.
Star Wars and Harry Potter. And so,
I
so,
love it.
so Star Wars and Harry Potter are my comfort food movies. I go to them when I need that soothing nostalgia sweet sensation. I already know what's going to happen. I don't need to watch it because I'm super engaged in the storyline. I'm not going to get escalated in the climax of the movie because I'm just like, oh, I know what's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone listening out there can identify what their comfort food movies or shows are, to do just one of those, not hours or a whole day of that, but just as a mechanism of pushing pause on further escalation. And then once that pause is achieved, going and doing any of the other strategies we mentioned. That the
Oh,
distraction is not enough in and of itself, but it is a useful tool when used properly.
yeah. Yes. I couldn't agree more. And I love the way that you're putting it too, that it's a useful for what it's useful for, but don't act like it's going to do everything for you.
Yes.
And I think it's really important to put it in the context of a thing you can do to support yourself. If this is becoming too much, you can pause it,
Mm-hmm.
but don't just pause it because you're just saving it for later, right?
Exactly.
Pause it and then do something to take care of yourself, right?
Exactly.
Regulate or fortify, resource, those kinds of things.
And in that example of needing the distraction, I'm thinking of really extreme cases such as people getting panic attacks
Mm-hmm.
or getting extreme states of dysregulation where they truly are borderline a danger to themselves or someone
Yeah.
else. And that's really when you want to call on these tools.
Yeah.
On that tool specifically. If you're not quite there yet, do the deep breathing, do the regulating touch, do everything else because that you may not need the distraction because you're not quite to that extreme mental state yet.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a great technique when you need it to use because it is what the survival system would do, right? If
Mm-hmm.
we don't do the distracting for it, and I think it's a way of taking the reins back in our hands, then our survival system will kick on and we'll fight it out, or we'll run from it. We'll do flight, which is distraction too, or we'll freeze up, which can be that same kind of like just I'm just going to sit here in front of the TV all day.
Mm-hmm.
So using that technology to help our nervous system out, I think, is so brilliant. And I love that
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about a film or a show that so that there aren't surprises. There aren't as much. There is likely to be less activation for
Mm-hmm.
you around it. That's also really reassuring to the nervous system to go back down that same path again that you've been down before, where you know it's going to happen. But then with shows, with movies, even with fiction, reading fiction is another great way to do this. We get to leave our story and go
Yes.
to someone else's story.
Hmm.
And that by itself is really regulating.
Hmm.
But like you say, it's just a way to take a break or to turn down that activation. The emotion is still going to be there and it's going to be waiting for us, and we do need to still tend to it, or it's going to throw us back into a state of overload later.
Yes.
I want to give one other technique that I think is kind of along these lines. It's kind of like distraction by giving the brain something else to focus on, but it's also a way to come back from distraction if we've gotten there, because we give ourselves something to focus on. The technique I'm thinking of is called 5 4 3 2 1, and I think it's particularly useful for if we're going into overload and or approaching survival reactivity, because one of the things that's happening in that moment is our nervous system is making what's called a prediction error. We may have talked about this before, but the prediction error is our nervous system thinks that we're in some kind of survival danger, even though we're not. It has predicted that whatever's happening to us is going to kill us. And so we need to go into fight, flight, freeze, or appease. I say appease, you say fawn. That's fine. So 5 4 3 2 1 is a way to interrupt that prediction error by feeding current sensory data to our nervous system. So you name 5 things that you can see, and it's useful if you can actually say the word out loud, but at least naming the word for it in your head. 5 things I can see, 4 things I can touch or feel, things maybe already touching me, like my waistband. 3 things I can hear, 2 things I can smell, and 1 thing I can taste. If for any reason you don't have use of one of your senses, you can always exchange things I can think. So, like during COVID, there were a lot of people doing 2 things I can think instead of 2 things I can smell. But that's a great way to feed current sensory data to your nervous system that is not a tiger, not a tiger, not a tiger, not a tiger. The nervous system gets the point that, oh, okay, whatever's going on in here, I'm not actually in danger because there's zero signs of danger in my sensory perception. I also like to write them down, 5 4 3 2 1, because I think they make beautiful little poems, and that can also be further regulating.
Oh, that does sound like a beautiful poem. I love that.
It's a great way to capture a moment too, even though that's not necessarily the goal.
That's a really beautiful way to turn it into an art. And speaking of art,
Yeah,
it's such an amazing way to transmute and emote as well.
yeah. I think that's ones that, and maybe some other techniques we could mention are ones to get into, like they're really useful to use as channels for our emotion so that we don't have the buildup that's more likely to throw us into overload.
Yeah, so that would be the emotional processing
Yeah.
aspect.
Yeah. So a real intentional kind of, and some of us can even do it. It's possible to even do it when you're not having a current experience of the feeling, but going to
Hmm.
the canvas or going to the thing that collage or poetry or any kind of art that you're going to create, even music or sound, whatever it is, with the intention of today I'm going to channel some of my sorrow. Today I'm going to channel some of my anger. Today I'm going to channel some of
Hmm.
my worry about things, as it relates to my grieving process. Then even just with that intention and going through those motions of, whatever kind of creation we're doing, allow ourselves to put some of that feeling into that space.
And I think when people think about doing that, they often develop a fear response that they are going to go into emotional overload, which leads to an avoidance of the emotional processing. And I want to just speak to that dynamic a little bit, which is when you are courageous enough to face it, you move through it. Afterwards, there is so much freedom. The sensation of this weight lifted off of your chest, lifted off of your shoulders, lifted off of you entirely from moving through it and expressing it. So I want to just speak that it's very normal to feel afraid to approach this at all. And it's so worth it to be courageous enough to do so.
Hmm. Yes. Oh, I love that you brought that in, Selysa. Yeah, it's such an important point to make. And because of the programming that so many of us got, whether you're raised as a boy or a girl, you probably got the programming that these feelings things are things to turn away from, like to just turn them down and get back to feeling better. This, like the
The
kind of
better
general,
that you're
yeah,
back to is not a fulfilling, happy life.
right. Because what's really happening is we're just saving those feelings up for later. And
Yes.
they'll come back out, whether it's through chronic pain, inflammation, illness, or through more greater likelihood and higher activation of going into survival mode.
Mm-mm.
So, giving ourselves these opportunities to just kind of come close to the feeling and hang out near it for a little bit and then regulate back out. And then maybe come a little bit closer again and allow ourselves a little bit longer of an expression and then come back out, regulate, do those techniques to come back out of it. And sort of titrating our experience of approaching and being with feelings, I think, is a really useful part of that reprogramming that you're talking about doing by allowing ourselves to have the courage to hang out with the feeling. The more we do that, the better we get at it. The more accustomed our nervous system gets to this. Okay, this is a thing that comes up, and then we'll go back down. This is a thing that comes up, and we process it, and we'll release it, and then the experience, my activation level goes back down. Right. This sort of like experience of essentially the wave of the emotion we become accustomed to. And then instead of having that sense that every wave is going to take us out, we're like, oh, I've been with waves like this before. I can handle this, which is
Mm-hmm.
a pretty magical place to be in terms of being with feelings. So many of us get raised with that sense of, I just like, don't look over there. Just don't, just like stay on the bright side. And that's our whole approach to life, which means we're saving up all these uncomfortable feelings to come out in these really less comfortable, less controlled, less workable ways.
Yeah. It's so much more beautiful to have created a painting that expresses your grief and to hang that painting on your wall for as long as you're feeling the grief than it is to have an angry outburst at someone in your home.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are the options. It doesn't have to be a painting.
Right, right.
It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a painting, but those are the options. If you don't deal with it, if you don't
Mm-hmm.
face the music,
Mm-hmm.
it will come out in a way
Yeah.
that will be harmful to other people or yourself or both.
Yeah, it's like it's coming out anyway. You might as well let it out and channel it intentionally so that it doesn't like blow out of you and hurt people, you possibly included. I also want to touch on that from the aspect again of someone who's with someone who's grieving, because there can be this tendency for support people to try to hold back from talking about the person that was lost, or upsetting the grieving person, or showing them things that might be that they might need to deal with from the person who was lost or in their grieving process, because we don't want to upset them, right? We don't want to
Kind
bring
of
it
a
up.
walking on eggshells,
Yeah.
tiptoeing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Hmm.
Not just tiptoeing, but like really trying to like pad the existence of the grieving person so that they have nothing at all come up for them, but also especially nothing relating to their grieving process come up for them. And I totally get that as like a really tender, compassionate, approach to someone that you care about and you don't want to see them in pain. I really want to make clear that they're in it anyway, and you're not saving them anything by trying to avoid or tiptoe around or look the other way from the thing that's up for them.
Hmm.
And many of us in our grieving processes, right away there can be a lot of support. There can be a lot of people reaching out. There can be like food trains and people calling you, and cards coming in, or all kinds of real care from folks. But that tends to drop off so quickly. Maybe not so quickly is the way to put it, but much quicker than the grieving person is usually ready for, even
Hmm.
whether or not they think of it that way. The support that's coming toward us often ends before our grieving process ends.
Hmm.
And so then we're left in this state of, or this period of still being with what's up for us, but nobody else is talking about it. Nobody else is looking at it. Nobody else is making room for it or us to have it. So, as a support person, I think it's really important to continue to check in with your grieving people months, a year, a couple of years after their loss. I think it's also important to not avoid the subject, not avoid talking about the person that was lost. And in
Mm-hmm.
kind of even in the opposite direction, give the grieving person opportunities to talk about their loved one. Ask them
Mm-hmm.
if they want to share something about what it was like living with them, or what it was like, when they were, some important times with them, or what it's been like losing them. That
Mm-hmm.
gives the grieving person an opportunity to let out some of these feelings in a controlled way, in a way that is with someone that can support them, in a way that they're not alone doing it, and in a way that's likely to help them get some more of these feelings out without going into overload.
Yes. It's a village. It takes a village.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing, and I want to actually ask you if you'd like to say more about this. I think it's important too in this process, even when we're not having uncomfortable feelings up, because even for full-time grievers, there are moments where we're not currently with the uncomfortable feelings, right? I think it's so important to resource throughout our grieving process and really throughout our lives, so that we have room to be with, or resilience to be with, the feelings that come up for us. Are there ways that you regularly resource and or would recommend people resourcing in the grieving process?
Absolutely. I think that what works best for me is making sure I spend at least 1 hour outside every day, which is why I got a dog. I needed a living entity to force me to spend at least 1 hour outside every day. And also having practices of regular emoting. So for me, it's journaling, dancing, playing music. Those are my three biggest ones. And it can be a 3 minute dance while my microwave is heating up my lunch. And it can be going to a dance. It doesn't have to be, these can happen in microscopic windows of my day that normally people would just spend mindlessly or unintentionally. And they can also happen in big events that happen, such as sitting down and practicing an instrument for a good long while.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, music is particularly close, and therefore dance, because dance is very correlated to music because both of my parents were musicians. So for me personally, that's a very, very effective strategy. However, for other people, what I've seen work is taking more, not so much a speed walk, but a meditative walk, of a going really slowly and feeling the sensation of their foot as it moves along the ground, the heel, arch, toe, next foot, heel, arch, toe, and just staying super mindful with that. So it's things that fill your resource cup up. Spending time in the sun, spending time in not just outside, but in as high quality of nature as you have access to, such as a park or a pond. I think bodies of water have a beautiful way of moving through energy. Of course, getting Reiki. I can't believe I'm mentioning that one this late in the game. I receive Reiki super regularly, and it's a super powerful mechanism for the energy to flow through me and out of me to keep it constantly in motion. And there's as many ways to get resourced and to fill up your cup as there are humans on earth. So for someone it might be painting, another person gardening, another person spreading ashes in a really meaningful way over a long duration of time, taking a trip to all of your loved ones' favorite places and putting a little bit of the ashes in every single one, and taking a year or two to do that, and really honoring that process as a part of the grieving and the letting go.
Yeah, so beautiful. I really appreciate the things that you're including in this category. Definitely getting out in nature, I think, is something that so many of us think of as a great resourcing. I also think of it because this gets into something I think is bigger than we have time for at this moment. But when we're with someone else and we're processing our feelings, we're benefiting from what's called network capacity. It means just another brain, another nervous system being with us in it. So we have more room to be with the feeling, right? Because there's another body, another nervous system being with us. Being out in nature is quite like that too, right? There's this
Mm-hmm.
hugeness of nature that can really hold us, however big
Mm-hmm.
our experience is. We can really
Mm-hmm.
use, and I think we naturally tap into the network capacity of nature and as the living organism that we're a part of. I think that's so useful. And you can, like you're talking about getting out in nature an hour a day. If it's the only opportunity you have, folks can go to a park. You can garden. That's what I did for many years when I had little babies and I wasn't taking them on as many hikes. We do a bunch of gardening as a way to get out there. So whatever you need to do to fit it into your life, I think it's a really useful resource.
Mm-hmm.
Some of what you were talking about though too, I really appreciate like the expression forms. Like dancing, painting, music. Any kind of art that we're channeling some of our feelings through. Those can be useful techniques as we're channeling feelings through them, and they can also be useful techniques to help us have more resilience even when we're not using them as an expression. Like even just moving our body, doing some dancing if that's one of our things, or playing music is such a great thing because it's such a full brained activity. It lights our brains up in the way that almost nothing else does. But all of these expressive forms can be great for increasing our resilience, even if we're not using them to express.
And with music, if you sing, you're also doing a regulatory breath.
That's right. That's right.
So just singing in the shower is an
Hmm.
amazing one, or singing while you drive, or singing anywhere. But those are places lay people normally like to sing, or in the
Yeah.
shower and in the car.
Yeah. Yes, I've been singing a lot more over the last several months. I think it's really been useful. I'm a singer anyway, but I think that's a really, really great one, both for expressing and for resourcing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, both ends of that spectrum are available there. And that's maybe something too to think about too. Like I think there's this sort of, I talk about it differently in different spaces, but I think of it as a spectrum between resourcing and expressing. Like there's building up ourselves on one side and building up what our nervous system can hold because we're taking such good care of ourselves. And that is getting out in nature. That is moving. That is making sure that we're getting enough breath, singing, all kinds of things that are good for our bodies, taking really good care of our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the other end, think ways of getting feeling out, giving ourselves opportunities and channels to allow the feelings to move. So I think all the things that you described there are so great for both, or from one end of that spectrum or the other. And tending to both ends is really, I think, the most useful way to approach allowing emotional processing without going into emotional overload.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So to summarize, we need to get resourced to prevent the emotional overload. We also need to actively emote to prevent the emotional overload. And if the emotional overload still does come, use the tools to come down from it and then to process, and then also use the resourcing to heal from the emotional overload, because the emotional overload can sometimes be re-triggering or re-traumatizing, and that in and of itself needs to be healed from,
Mm-hmm.
not just the event
Yeah.
that triggered the emotional overload in the first place. And to be tender and compassionate and empathetic with yourself and everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think last piece along those lines for me at least is just remembering that it is a process, right? Grief is a feeling, but grieving is a process.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us are, we get this idea that when we lose someone, and that's just one of the gateways to grieving, but when we lose someone, we're supposed to have this big expression for a very short period of time, and then we're supposed to get back to life and be done with that. So keeping in context, keeping it in our the way that we're framing what's happening to us as this process that I'm going through or a season that I'm going through, I think is also so useful for helping us stay on the processing end and spending less time in the overload end.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful.
Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.